I noticed the missing chair before anyone said anything. It wasn't dramatic, just a small gap in the line of seats around the dining table, like a tooth pulled and never replaced. Everyone else had a place set, plates warming, glasses aligned, napkins folded into careful triangles. My place, the one I'd sat in since I was 12, was gone. For a second I assumed it was a mistake. Thanksgiving at my parents' house ran on muscle memory. My mother orchestrated it the same way every year, same dishes, same seating order, same jokes repeated with slight variations. She didn't improvise. I stood there with my coat still on, pie in my hands, and waited for someone to notice. No one did. My cousins were already talking about flights and weather delays. My aunt leaned over the table to adjust the gravy boat. My father sat at the head, cutting bread with slow precision, not looking up. Finally, I asked, quietly, where should I sit? The room hesitated, just enough to register. My mother turned from the kitchen doorway, wiped her hands on a towel, and looked at the table as if seeing it for the first time. "Oh," she said. Then, after a pause that felt intentional, "We didn't set a place for you." I waited for the rest, an explanation, an apology, a joke to soften it. Instead, she added, calmly, "There's no room for disappointments." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. It sounded like a rule she'd memorized. Something inside me went very quiet. I'd been the disappointment for as long as I could remember, though no one had ever named it so cleanly. I was the child who didn't fit the story they told about themselves, the one whose failures were always public and whose successes were treated like accidents. I looked around the table. 23 relatives, people who had watched me grow up, people who had eaten my food, slept in my room when they visited, asked me for favors when it suited them. Not one of them spoke. A few avoided my eyes. One cousin looked uncomfortable, then quickly distracted herself with her phone. My father kept slicing bread. I felt the familiar pull to explain myself, to say something small and apologetic, to make it easier for everyone else. Instead, I put the pie down on the counter. "I understand," I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady. My mother nodded once, satisfied, already turning back toward the kitchen as if the matter were closed. I picked up my bag. As I walked toward the door, I stopped at the head of the table. My father finally looked up, irritation flickering across his face, like I was interrupting something important. I reached into my bag and took out the envelope. It was plain, no name on it. Slightly creased at the corners from being handled too many times. I'd carried it with me for months, not because I planned to use it, but because letting go of it felt like agreeing to forget. I placed it gently on his plate. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said. Then, after a breath, "I finally know why you hate me." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The room went completely silent. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out, closed the door behind me, and stood on the porch long enough to hear someone inside ask, "What was that about?" Then I left. I didn't hear what happened next until later, but I can imagine the first few seconds clearly. My father would have stared at the envelope, annoyed more than curious. My mother would have told him not to open it, that it was probably another attempt at drama. Someone, maybe my aunt, would have insisted on knowing what was inside. Eventually, someone would have opened it. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't known existed until the previous year: hospital records, legal filings, correspondence between two lawyers dated decades back. Proof that my father wasn't my biological parent, and that he had known since before I was born. Proof that the story I grew up with had a footnote they'd hoped I'd never find. I learned the truth by accident. A clerk at a records office hesitated when pulling my file, then asked a question she shouldn't have. One thing led to another. When I confronted my parents privately, my mother cried. My father said nothing. Then they asked me together to let it go. "It doesn't change anything," my mother said, but it explained everything: the distance, the resentment that never had a clear cause, the way love in our house always felt conditional, like a loan I could default on at any moment. The envelope wasn't revenge. It was documentation, and once it was opened, the room shifted. My cousin Mark, who worked in healthcare compliance, recognized the significance immediately. He read the dates twice, asked where it came from. When my father refused to answer, Mark made a call, not to the police, but to a colleague who specialized in medical records audits. Because buried in those documents was something else: evidence of falsified consent forms. A quiet manipulation that crossed from family secret into professional misconduct. My father had built his authority carefully over decades. He was respected, deferred to, untouchable, until he wasn't. The conversation stopped being about me very quickly. By the time my phone rang an hour later, my mother's voice sounded unfamiliar, smaller. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I didn't do anything," I replied. "I told the truth," she cried then. "Not about me. About what would happen next." The consequences unfolded without me. There were inquiries, awkward calls, a resignation framed as early retirement. Relatives recalibrated their loyalties quietly, pretending they'd always had doubts. No one asked me to come back. A few weeks later, my aunt sent a message: "I wish things hadn't gone so far." I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in watching them rearrange the story again, this time with new villains and softer language. What surprised me most wasn't the fallout. It was the absence of relief. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel avenged. I felt lighter. For the first time, the disappointment didn't belong to me. I had spent years trying to earn a place at that table, thinking if I worked harder, apologized better, became quieter, I'd deserve the chair they kept taking away. But the chair was never the point. They needed me standing, waiting, uncertain. They needed the imbalance. Walking away didn't fix the past. It didn't heal the quiet grief of growing up unloved in ways that leave no bruises. But it did something important. It ended the lie. And without it, their power over me was still there, but it was quiet now, manageable. Phenite, I don't know if I'll ever sit at that table again. I know this: if I do, it won't be because they made room. It'll be because I stopped asking.